believe the Bible? Why do we believe the Bible? Different people have different reasons. If you ask me, it's because we have evidence, ample evidence. We're going to take a brief look at just one piece in particular this morning. Jesus makes a very interesting prophecy in Matthew chapter 24, and if you're a casual Bible reader, it might be confusing. It might be intimidating. It might not make a lot of sense. But if you're a fan of history, the prophecy that Jesus makes here is shocking. If you were a Jew at the time, this would have been unbelievable. If you're a fan of history, not only would it be shocking, it would be unreasonable. It would be creepy, even, how accurate that things ended up being. The events that would have had to happen were so unlikely, it's really kind of hard to overstate. So I want to tell you the story of this and why this just so happens to be the case. So much of the account that we're going to talk about is from Professor Robert Garland's work on the First Jewish-Roman War, as well as some of Josephus's work. They're great secular sources if you want to look into it even more. So let's get started. What did Jesus predict, first of all? In verse 2, he says that the temple is going to be destroyed, but not only destroyed, but not one stone shall be left here on top of another. Okay, so a little bit more specific than it's going to be destroyed. If we jump down to verse 34, he not only says that, but he gives us a timeline. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Okay, so there's a lot more details in between verse 2 and verse 34, and that's where a lot of confusing stuff happens. But if we just stick to these two minimal facts, these two facts are easy enough to understand. There's not much confusing about them. Just sticking with the bare minimum, what can we learn from this? I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. The temple was destroyed. It did happen. It did happen in their generation. In AD 70 specifically is when it happened. About 30 or 40 years after Jesus said these words, the temple was destroyed, just like Jesus predicted. But why was this so unlikely? You might think a skeptic would say, well, Jews didn't exactly like the Romans. Romans didn't exactly like the Jews. They're always fighting each other. It's not that difficult for someone to predict that, hey, the Romans are going to come and destroy the temple. But if you think that, if you've ever heard someone say that, they don't know much about the first century Judea, because that wasn't exactly the case. Before the Great Jewish Revolt in 66 AD, the relationship between Rome and Israel was pretty amicable. It was pretty good, at least relatively speaking. The Roman Empire was famous for being relatively hands-off, scholars say. They describe their relationship with places that they conquer as understanding, non-divisive, even passive is how Rome is described. They don't go around looking for trouble. In general, they have good relations with the Jews. The relationship with Rome and Jews was so good that the capital city of Rome, about 1 in 20 people in Rome were Jews. This small minority were Jews. That's how welcome they were. That's how well they were treated. And this was around the time of Christ's birth, toward the beginning of the first century. So many kind concessions could be the cause of that. Many kind concessions by the Romans were made toward them to keep the peace. Jews were exempted from working every Sabbath day. They didn't have to work. They didn't have to pay taxes on things that they did then. Not only that, but they didn't have to pay taxes every 7 years, every seventh year, the year of the sabbatical year. They didn't have to pay taxes then either. Very unusual. Very unusual. They were granted special exemptions from pagan rituals, and Rome even minted special coins free of imagery to appease the Jewish people. Jews took the prohibition against idols and images very seriously, not only idols that you would worship, but even images of people on money. That was no-go. So Rome even minted special coins just for the Jews to appease their scruples. Jews were not required to recognize the divinity of the emperor as all other people in the empire had to do. If you were part of the Roman Empire, you had to worship the emperor, but not the Jews. They had a special exemption. They merely had to offer prayers for the emperor's well-being. That's easy enough. Jews were free to practice their religion. They were free to enjoy their holidays and follow the customs as they wished. As long as they didn't rock the boat, Rome didn't really care what in the world they did. Judea was considered a client kingdom, And they had their own Jewish rulers. This is what we find in the New Testament, the Herods. It's usually Herod, but there's a bunch of different Herods. And Herod presided over the region. He was, they were usually half Jewish, so at least partially Jewish. They also permitted the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious leaders, to act independently of imperial authority. They could do pretty much anything they wanted, up to a point. They couldn't execute people. They just had to ask Rome, and then Rome would usually say, whatever you want to do. So even the Sanhedrin were able to do whatever they wanted. Rome was content to interfere as little as possible with existing administrations in areas that they controlled. They weren't looking for trouble. So this was very unusual for Jesus to say that the temple was going to be destroyed. Rome was protecting them from any outside invaders. There was nobody that was dumb enough to attack this Roman province, this Roman area. And the relationship with Rome was pretty good. Rome went out of its way to protect and appease the Jews. And even as much trouble when someone did rock the boat, for instance, Jesus. Rome still didn't want to kill him. They didn't want to do anything. They wanted to let Jesus go. But because the Jews really insisted, Rome said, fine, do whatever you want. Kill him if you want to. This is my paraphrase, of course. So some additional context beyond the relationship. Even if the Romans really did hate the Jews and war was inevitable, Rome would not typically destroy temples. This would be atypical and unusual. Instead, what they would do is they would rebrand it. For instance, the temple of Diana would be the temple of Artemis, or Jupiter, or Zeus would be Jupiter, and so on. They were religiously ambiguous. They were a little bit more fluid like that. Temples, for the Roman culture, were some of the most important buildings that ever existed, and they were incredibly expensive. The temple was just finished just a few years before Jesus said these words. It was practically brand new still. And Jesus said, this brand new thing, it's going to get destroyed. This thing that the Romans value very highly, it's going to get destroyed. This was such a strange thing for Jesus to say. They would have the tendency to not destroy temples. So, admittedly, while Judea at the time of Christ in the first century was not a daycare, neither was it a war zone that some portray it as. Riots would happen, but Rome would come in, put the riot down, and things would just go back to normal. So even when things did get kicked up, Rome would just come in, put an end to it, and then everybody would kind of forget that happened. So for instance, in 6 AD, Judas of Galilee, he led a revolt, but is quickly put down, and things went back to normal. In AD 40, Emperor Caligula, he had a good idea. By good idea, I mean he had a really bad idea. He tried to put a statue of himself inside the temple in Jerusalem, and that went down about as well as you imagine. They were not happy about that, and Caligula, he backed down, and they said, okay, fine, we'll go back to normal. So there were revolts, there were riots, there were all sorts of things happening, but there would be an input to it, and they would just go back to normal. So it would take a multitude of simultaneous accidents, incredible bad luck, and remote coincidences for Jesus' comically unlikely prophecy to actually take place, and in the time frame that he said. So let's get into exactly what happened. You've probably heard of the two main sects of Jews. We have the Pharisees and we have the Sadducees. Okay? And while they didn't exactly love the Romans, they got along pretty well with them. And on the other hand, there were the more extreme Zealots. And later in time, not at Jesus' time, later in time, they were kind of the instigators. They were the ones who were starting riots. They were the ones causing trouble. But around the time of Christ, they were their activity was largely that of noncompliance, rather than outright violence and rebellion. So even having the Zealots there, it would not be a sure thing that there would be conflict between the Jews and the Romans. But a couple of decades after Christ, around 50 or 60 AD, there was a more extreme splinter group. So off of the Zealots, a group splintered, and they were called the Sicarii, dagger men. And they literally had daggers in their cloaks. And they would go into crowds and just start stabbing people, and then put the daggers away, and they would fall. They would hide in the crowd. So their goal was to kill Romans and kill anyone who didn't also want to kill Romans. They were extreme. They were extreme. And they weren't around at the time of Christ. They didn't come until a few decades later. So we have the Sicarii, these kind of wild extremists. And then Rome, that's on the Jewish side. And on the Roman side, their more lenient procurator was replaced in 64 AD by a man named Gessius Florus. And he was very hard-lined. So whenever they did something, he would escalate. So this is very unusual, and this was a big shift in what happened historically. So this extremist group, the Sicarii, they were more and more attacking Roman citizens, so the Romans escalated, and they responded by entering into the temple, plundering it, and then murdering thousands of people. Okay? So, like we said already, as you can expect, another revolt ensued, but these kinds of revolts, they happened. This would not be highly unusual. Whenever a revolt happened, Rome would come in with overwhelming force, put it down, and then peace would ensue. And that seemed to be the plan. Again, in history, we know that General Cestius Gallus, with an overwhelming force of about 30,000 men, marched toward Jerusalem to put it down, and it should have been a relatively easy siege of Jerusalem to get things back under control. But, interestingly, he was ambushed. He was ambushed on the way there, and critically, he lost some of his siege equipment, the very things that he would need to come and put down the rebellion. And not only that, but the timing that this general had couldn't have been any worse. He came just before the October rainy season, and as he arrived to Jerusalem, he was worried that the rains would cause his supply lines to be cut off, and he would be stranded there with these men, no way to feed them. They might abandon, and bad things would happen. So instead of attacking Jerusalem like he was supposed to and putting the riots down, he retreated. He falls back. And then the Sicarii, they know how well the first ambush went, so they ambushed him again, and apparently he didn't learn his lesson. He was ambushed again, and what happened was one of the worst, most embarrassing defeats the Roman army had ever experienced. The Jews killed thousands of Romans. Up until this point, this was possibly the worst defeat Rome had ever endured. And in a situation like this, typically when there's a small conflict between a tiny nation like Israel and a much larger power like Rome, the tiny nation would negotiate some concessions. Hey, we're beating you guys up, let's get some concessions. And then Rome would get some concessions in return. Nobody wants to really go to open war, even though Rome could easily win. It's expensive and it's difficult. So they would both get some concessions, and they can both go back to their sides and say, ha, we won, we got the Romans to do this. And then the Romans would say, hey, we got the Jews to do this. And then they would both save face, and then peace would come back. But these extremists, the Sicarii, they saw these two great wins as a sign that maybe God was with us. God is with us. He wants us to not push for peace. He wants us to push for complete victory, and they fought for all-out open war with Rome. It would have been much better for them if they didn't win this ambush, because what ends up happening makes things very bad for the Jews. Emperor Nero appointed a new general, General Vespasian, to take over and crush the rebellion, bringing to bear more than double the number of troops as before, over 60,000 or so troops. Vespasian, he comes, and he begins reconquering the land all around Jerusalem, all the different cities and fortresses around Jerusalem, relatively easy. But Jerusalem itself was not attacked yet. Jerusalem was not attacked yet. To think that Jerusalem could have been successfully sieged was nearly unthinkable. It was one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. It had not one, not two, but 3 sets of walls, city walls. Okay. It had 164 towers, enough food and water reserves to last literally for years. So what are you going to do, siege the city and sit out there for years? That's an incredibly expensive proposition. And at the time of the revolt, the temple was transformed, the area was transformed into a nearly impregnable fortress, which is sworn to be defended to the death. So this is one of the reasons that the Sicarii could be so brazen with Rome. They really didn't fear Rome, and they believed God to be on their side. So before Vespasian can come and lean really hard on Jerusalem, something shocking happens. News comes that Emperor Nero has committed suicide. He did some bad things that the Roman government didn't like, so they declared him an enemy of the state. He kills himself. So Roman law requires that Vespasian now and any other generals have to halt any activity. You can't continue any war. You have to stop and wait to be reassigned by the new emperor and have new orders sent to you. So all the Roman commanders had to do this. They had to wait before they could take any further action. And it's at this point that Rome politically goes into free fall. This is the infamous Year of Four Emperors, the Year of the Four Emperors. So after Nero's death, Galba takes over. He's quickly assassinated and followed by a man named Otho, Emperor Otho. And he's quickly usurped by a man named Vitellius, who then, surprise, surprise, is quickly usurped again by Vespasian. So now General Vespasian becomes Emperor Vespasian, but Rome politically is as strong as one of those little bubbles in bubble wrap. It's fragile. Things are barely hanging on. So Vespasian becomes emperor, and at any normal time, rulers are already reluctant to commit resources to a siege. Sieges are notorious for being extremely costly, both in terms of money, but also in terms of life. Not necessarily from warfare, but sieges could last weeks or months or years. And as the army is surrounding the city, the conditions become incredibly unsanitary for the sieging army. And people just die left and right from disease. So even if the Romans weren't afraid of the Jewish army, they were terrified of the diseases and things that would ravage their camps. But this is no normal time. Never in Roman history has there ever been so much political unrest. Vespasian is emperor, but his hold on power is weak. There have been 3 or 4 other emperors have just come and gone in a matter of months. And he needs to establish his authority quickly and his popularity as well. Otherwise, the empire could experience this extended civil war because armies were loyal to their general, not necessarily to the state, not necessarily to Rome itself. So this is what happened with Vespasian. His army came and fought Vitellius' army, and his army won, so now he's emperor. So he didn't want someone else to come and conquer him, so he needed to unite Rome under himself. So he's in this tricky situation. He knows that the best way to unite Rome under him is to achieve a spectacular military victory. This is the way that you get popular back in the day. You remember in the Old Testament when David would go out and defeat the Philistines? They would say, oh, David has killed all these people and Saul killed just a little bit. So they would sing songs and praise them and dance and all this sort of stuff. And this was the way to become popular in the ancient world. So Vespasian knows this, but unfortunately, he can't go himself. If he leaves Rome, who knows what in the world will happen? He needs to keep an eye on Rome. And also, unfortunately for Jerusalem, so Vespasian needs to have this great military victory. And unfortunately for Jerusalem, they're still in the news at this time, and Vespasian has his eye on them, and they happen to be the perfect target. The city's big enough to be notable. If they're defeated, then that will give him enough clout to have claim to the title of emperor. But he can't leave Rome. He needs to keep it on Rome. He can't trust any other general. So if Vespasian sends another general, and that general wins, what's going to happen? He's going to get the glory. Vespasian isn't, and then he's going to have another legitimate competitor to the throne. So he can't do that. So it seems that Jesus' prophecy is going to fail. But it just so happens to be, wouldn't you know it, that Vespasian has a son who also happens to be a very capable general, Titus. So Vespasian sends his son to go conquer Jerusalem. Any glory that Titus gets will be reflected upon his father. And he's not worried that his son is going to usurp him. So, lucky, lucky, lucky. So now it's the spring of AD 70. AD 70, Jerusalem is once again fully under siege. The Jews have fortified Jerusalem beyond what it already had been. And like we said, they've stockpiled enough food and water to last literally for years. They're not really afraid. They're not afraid at all. They're doing this kind of thing from the walls, like neener, okay? Nobody realistically expected the Romans to succeed, at least not in any reasonable amount of time. Titus had fully 1/4 of the entire Roman army, and the expectation was that he had no way to feed such a large army for long enough to outlast Jerusalem, even raiding the surrounding areas and all that sort of stuff. He likely didn't have enough food to last that long. And on several occasions, Titus offers peace terms. He doesn't want to destroy Jerusalem. He doesn't want to waste 6 or 7 years out here staring at the walls of Jerusalem while they starve out. He just wanted to put an end to the uprising and get things back to normal, but they always refused. It seemed that they were at a stalemate. And again, Jesus' prophecy, it's going to fail. Because we're right at the end. Most of the people who were alive at the time Jesus said this, they're starting to die. It's been 30 or 40 years now. So there's not much more time for this to happen. So the prophecy, the temple's standing, the prophecy is bound to fail. But, wouldn't you know it, the extremists, they foolishly decide to burn the food supply that they have stockpiled so that they could spur the inhabitants to fight. Isn't that a smart idea? Now there was no other option. In the end, Titus encircles the defenders with a wall around Jerusalem so they couldn't get any food in, they couldn't get anybody out. They encircled the entire city of Jerusalem with a wall that's about 5 miles in circumference. They starved the defenders out. And eventually 2 of the 3 sets of the city walls are broken through. Josephus tells us that before Titus makes his final assault, he debates, what should I do with the temple? Temples were extremely valuable. They were the symbol of power and might and glory. And hey, even if we don't like their God, we're just going to stick one of our own gods in there. But what should we do? Titus decides to save the temple. He decides to save the temple. Jesus' prophecy, again, looks like it's going to fail. He decides to save the temple. It was not supposed to be destroyed, but when the Roman soldiers break through, chaos ensues, and tragically, one soldier takes a firebrand and throws it into the temple. The temple catches the blaze. But again, Titus orders, put the fire out, extinguish it. The temple is not to be destroyed. But nobody listens. Nobody obeys him. What are the chances? What are the chances? And it's at this point that the temple burns to the ground. Thousands of civilians who had taken refuge in the temple tragically die in the fire. They believed, this is how they thought of Jesus' prophecy. That this is what people thought at the time. They believed that God would not allow the temple to be destroyed, that he would cause a miracle to happen to prevent its destruction. This is how fervently they believed. They believed it to the death. How utterly unbelievable it would be to them that the temple could be destroyed. Wait. Jesus didn't say the temple was going to be burned. Because you could burn this building, there'd still be walls, there's brick and stuff, right? He didn't say that the temple would be burned. He said that not a single stone would be left standing on top of another one. Well, the siege isn't over yet. Siege isn't over yet. There were 3 sets of walls, remember, and we've only broken through 2 of them. So it's at this point, you remember when Titus was offering peace terms? Hey, you guys, you want to have peace? Hey, you want to have peace? It's at this point that the Jews think, I think it's time to negotiate. We've got a little bit of leverage. Let's start leveraging him. We'll get him to do what we want. They try to negotiate with him. There was still a contingent of defenders in one part of the city, and they try to negotiate with the Romans, and this sends Titus into a rage. He's offered them peace terms over and over again, but they constantly refuse. So Josephus, interestingly, records Titus' response. This is the Roman attitude toward the Jews. This is General Titus' response. He says, "You have been incited against the Romans by Roman kindness. We gave you this land with your own kings to rule over you. We maintained your ancestral laws, and we permitted you to live as you wished. Most important of all, we allowed you to exact tribute and collect offerings for your God. And now, like untamed reptiles, you spit your venom on those who have nourished you." That's how mad Titus is now. For so long, the Jews were not seen as enemies. For so long, Rome seemed to bend over backwards to accommodate them, but the defenders continued to act as if they had some sort of leverage. If instead they merely acknowledged that there was nothing left to fight for, Jerusalem may have been spared, but they preferred to fight to the death. So Titus, who was previously so inclined to be lenient, now he gives the order to raze the entire city. It's all to be destroyed. And that's exactly what happens. Titus commands to leave only 3 of the city's towers left standing as a monument to Jerusalem's former greatness. All that remains today of the once spectacular temple is the great platform upon which it once stood, today called the Temple Mount. Literally, not one stone left upon another. Jews to this day lament the destruction of their temple. This and much more, there's a lot more details between verse 2 and verse 34 that we haven't even touched on. Jesus predicted decades beforehand. Again, the unlikeliness of which can hardly be overstated. If any one of the unlikely things happened any differently, the temple very well could still have been standing to this day. Remember, during the time of Jesus, the relationship between the Jews and the Romans, it was one of relative peace. If, decades later, the Sicarii didn't incite the Romans with their extremist tactics, or if a different procurator than Gessius Florus was installed who wasn't so hard-lined and escalated things with the Jews, or if General Cestius Gallus wasn't ambushed and specifically his siege equipment destroyed before reaching Jerusalem, or if he didn't arrive in Jerusalem just before October in the rainy season, where it would have been difficult for him to remain there, he could have put down the revolt like many times before they were able to fortify and things really got out of hand. Or if, in his retreat, he was not again ambushed and so overwhelmingly and unexpectedly and embarrassingly defeated, perhaps Nero wouldn't have had to choose another general. Perhaps this was something they could have merely overlooked. Or if Nero had chosen a different general other than the soon-to-be Emperor Vespasian, who shortly would need a notable military win, then perhaps he wouldn't have set his sights on Jerusalem. Perhaps he would have set his sights on another city that he had to conquer. If Nero hadn't done many of the other things that he had done, that he was declared an enemy of the state and he ended up killing himself, then Rome wouldn't have been put into political unrest like it was. If Vespasian didn't have to pull back after the death of Nero, then perhaps the defenders of Jerusalem wouldn't have had enough time to fortify as much, and peace could have been restored much more easily without escalation. I think we're on number 9 now. If Galba hadn't made the mistakes that led to his being murdered shortly after his ascension to being emperor, if Otho hadn't also done likewise and gotten himself killed, if Vitellius also hadn't quickly lost his place as emperor, all within a very short period of time, then Rome wouldn't have been in nearly as fragile a place, politically speaking. If Vespasian was able to more quickly consolidate power, he may not have had to attack Jerusalem again. If Vespasian didn't have a son who just happened to be a very capable general that he could send to get glory for him, then perhaps Jerusalem wouldn't have been attacked. If the Jews were not so preoccupied with their own civil war, they could have had enough of an army to defend against Rome. Something I didn't mention, the Jews, as they were cooped up in Jerusalem, there was a civil war that was going on. This was part of the reason that Vespasian doesn't come and attack Jerusalem more quickly. They were killing themselves left and right. The extremists were murdering all of the moderates who wanted peace, so that when time came for peace, there was nobody to say yes, because they killed them all. So if they didn't do that, then perhaps peace could have been achieved and the temple would still be standing. If they didn't burn their food supply, perhaps they could have outlasted the Roman siege. If the soldier who first threw the firebrand into the temple had heard Titus's order to save the temple, do not destroy the temple, if he heard that, or if the other soldiers had heard or obeyed Titus's command to put the fire out, if the remaining defenders in Jerusalem had given up any earlier and not gone on to agitate and offend Titus, he would not have further raised the city. If Titus chose to leave the temple standing as a symbol of Jerusalem's former greatness instead of the towers, if any of these things took any longer, then the timeline that Jesus specified would not have panned out. It is absurd that Jesus predicted what he predicted. There's many more details that we haven't gone over that we could as to why it was such an incredibly shocking and unreasonable thing what Jesus said. That is, unless Jesus is who he said he is, God. Unless he was omniscient, and he wasn't just guessing, he really did know this is going to happen. He said that just like I could say, we'll tell you Sunday. Since Jesus is God, he certainly knew what was going to happen, and he was able to predict it in detail decades before. That's the God that we serve. That's the God that I love. When he says something, he means it. As we wrap up this morning, that same God says that he loves you. And he wants you to be with him forever. But he also says that if you're not baptized into his body for the remission of your sins, having believed, having repented, and having confessed him as Christ, if you do not do that, then you cannot be saved. You will die in your sins. Do you want to learn more about this God? Do you want to learn more about what he says? Do you want to discover more evidence of him in the Bible or even outside the Bible? Do you have questions? Even very hard questions? Would you please let us know? We want to help as much as we can. Would you please let us know before you leave here this morning? Are you ready to obey the gospel? Do you need the prayers of the church? If that's the case, then same to you. Would you please let us know before you leave here this morning? Or you can come forward right now, if you prefer, as we together stand and sing to encourage you.